Hello and welcome back to my channel, Civil War Reports. I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak. And recently I had a viewer post a comment asking if I could do something about the Battle of Antietam. I am standing right now in Northern Virginia. In fact, I really can't get much more northern because behind me is the Potomac River, and on the other side is Maryland. I am at White's Ford, and it was here, beginning on September 5th, that General Lee started to cross with his Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland for what would be known as the Antietam Campaign. This placard is in Northern Virginia, only a few yards away from the Potomac River, and it talks about Lee's crossing into Maryland for what would be called the Antietam Campaign. And I just want to read here an excerpt in a letter sent to President Jefferson Davis, where Lee is quoted as saying, quote, "I am aware that the movement is intended with much risk. Yet I do not consider success impossible and shall endeavor to guard it from loss." So let's take a look at the Confederacy in 1862, particularly Robert E. Lee and his command of the Army of Northern Virginia. In my opinion, I could be wrong, but in my opinion, I have to believe that early September of 1862, as the Army of Northern Virginia is crossing the Potomac River into Maryland, that this had to be probably the darkest days for the Union. I think even worse than when Lee would invade the North a second time for what would be the Gettysburg Campaign, because Lee is fresh off some victories. He whips McClellan on the peninsula during the 7 days battles. Then he turns his army and heads it north into Northern Virginia, where he whips General John Pope very thoroughly at the Battle of Second Bull Run. So he's whipped two Union armies in a very short period of time. And he wants to keep the momentum going. He wants to keep the initiative on the Confederate side. And he will take his army across this river. And while that is happening, two armies of the Confederacy have combined forces in Tennessee. About 18,000 men under General Kirby Smith, about 35,000 men under Braxton Bragg, and they are going into the border state of Kentucky. Around the same time Lee is going into the border state of Maryland, two Confederate armies are going into the border state of Kentucky. That's why I say this is probably the darkest days for the Union. So what was Lee hoping to achieve? He admits that success is going to be a little difficult. Well, he's hoping for a couple of things. One, he's hoping to gain a victory on what is Union soil. Yes, Maryland's a border state, but they stayed loyal to the Union, so it is considered Northern territory. He's also hoping to gain a lot of troops in the form of new recruits. Marylanders who sided with the Confederacy, he thought would come joining and volunteering to his army. And he was not alone on that. One soldier commented that he thought the South would pick up 50,000 recruits in Maryland. That's really stretching it. However, things are going to be different for the Army of Northern Virginia as well as the Army of the Potomac when the fighting heads into Maryland. The Confederacy, well, they're going to be basically on foreign soil. They're not going to have the home support that they enjoyed in Virginia, okay? And they're not going to get the recruits that they hoped for. Lee's army received about 300 volunteers. Why did this happen? Well, part of the reason is geography. Where Lee is crossing here at White's Ford, and it's named White's Ford due to the fact that this land here was owned by a Confederate cavalry major named E.V. White, who would serve as Stonewall Jackson's guide when they got into Maryland. Well, this part of Maryland over here is Western Maryland, and unlike Eastern Maryland, the Baltimore area, that area, Baltimore and the eastern part, was very pro-secessionist. And really, any Southerners that were, or any Marylanders who were going to join the Southern cause probably had already done so. But in this part of Maryland, secession was not as popular. The folks here were more pro-Union. So Lee crosses here, not realizing that this part of Maryland is not as pro-Southern as the eastern part. Secondly, his army, the soldiers, did not make much of an impression. The reports of them being in rags and not uniforms, that people could smell them before they could see them, that they were dirty, constantly scratching themselves, probably because they had lice, just did not make an impression on the folks here that this is an army they wanted to join, regardless of the fact that they are probably some of the hardest fighting men in American military history. But they just did not make a good impression. Now, for the Union side, they come into Maryland off defeat after defeat after defeat, one general after another defeated by Lee's army. But they're rejuvenated in two ways. One, despite the disaster on the peninsula, the men loved Little Mac. And to have him back in charge was energetic beyond belief. Secondly, when they were coming into Maryland, that's Union soil. And all of a sudden, they're met with a wave of patriotism they did not experience or enjoy when they were in Maryland. Remember, in Maryland, when they were in Virginia. When they're in Virginia, they're viewed as invaders. Here, they're viewed as rescuers. So that's part of the reason why Lee's army did not get the recruits that they desired, because of the geographical location and in many ways just how the men looked. As I mentioned in a previous video, five changes that came about as a result of the Battle of Antietam. I mentioned that Lee's army was the smallest it ever would be during the American Civil War, with the exception of the final campaign, the Appomattox campaign. Lee suffered very heavy casualties on the peninsula and at Second Bull Run. Now, he did get reinforcements from Richmond, but not enough to bring him up to the strength he had at the Peninsula Campaign, which was the largest the Army of Northern Virginia would ever be. So he crosses into Maryland. However, there were troops, some troops, who did not want to cross the Potomac River. They, in their mind, believed that they volunteered for the Southern cause to defend their homes, not to be part of an invasion force. Also, once his army did get across the Potomac River and into Maryland, because they moved so quickly from Second Manassas into Maryland, they did not bring much in the way of necessary provisions. Yes, ammunition, but not much in the way of food. And they were hoping to live off the land in Maryland. However, the time they invaded was not the best time of the year. And, well, their diet consisted of green apples, unripened corn, and unfortunately, a lot of Lee's men would be suffering from severe diarrhea and dysentery. And after suffering some losses at South Mountain 2 days before Antietam, Lee's army would only be about 38,000 men that he would have on the field for the Battle of Antietam. In regard to those troops that remained behind who did not want to cross, Lee had harsh words for them. He basically considered them cowards and said that they deserted their comrades during a time of peril. Let's compare Lee's invasion of Maryland to Bragg and Smith's invasion of Kentucky. They happened at basically around the same time. Lee's army starts crossing the Potomac. D.H. Hill's division will start crossing on September 4th. And it was shortly before that that Bragg and Smith put their army in motion to head into Kentucky. Now, Lee's venture here into Maryland will only be about 2 weeks long, because on September 18th, one day after the Battle of Antietam, Lee will begin his retreat back into Virginia. Exactly 1 month later, the Battle of Perryville will take place in Kentucky. Now, there are some comparisons, some similarities between the Battle of Antietam and Perryville. In my opinion, where both Lee here wins, for the most part, a tactical victory. I mean, he holds his own against an army twice his size. But because the casualties he suffered were so great and his army was so small to begin with, he has really no choice but to abandon the field and go back to Virginia. Bragg in Kentucky also wins a tactical victory, but suffers heavy casualties, and as a result, he too must abandon the field and head back to Tennessee. Now, also looking at Bragg, he also was hoping for a large number of recruits, volunteers, to come to the Confederate side. In fact, he took about 20,000 muskets with him into Kentucky to arm Kentucky volunteers who were going to fight for the Confederacy. Needless to say, most of those muskets would burden his retreat back to Tennessee. It would take about 3 days for Robert E. Lee to get his entire army across the Potomac River. And once across, he would head east toward Frederick, Maryland. That will be discussed at a later episode, especially when I talk about his lost order, Special Order 191. So what was his cavalry doing? What was Jeb Stuart doing? Well, Jeb Stuart was being Jeb Stuart, doing what he did best, and he was riding around the Union Army. He would cross the Potomac further downriver, and he would have a little difficulty doing it because when he got down there, the water level was higher than he anticipated, and he would cross. It would take him about 2 hours to get his entire cavalry across, but he would be there at Antietam in time for Robert E. Lee. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I really enjoyed bringing it to you, and I really enjoyed the fact that I was able to come to a piece of Civil War history here, White's Ford. It really does play a major part of Civil War history, not only in 1862, but 2 years later, when Jubal Early would take the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland for what would really be the last incursion of the Confederacy into Maryland. So this area right here does have some real Civil War significance. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I really enjoyed making it. This is the start of the Antietam campaign right here. For Civil War Reports, I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak. Thank you for watching. And if you like what you saw today, please hit the subscribe button. Give a thumbs up. Also, notify your friends. Let them know about this channel and ask them to subscribe as well. If you like, you may leave a question or a comment below, and perhaps I will answer your question in a future episode of Civil War Reports. Until next time, please keep the history alive.